Americans excitedly run through the streets in masses after hearing the news that World War I has come to an end. Papers with the titles "Germany surrenders" and "The war is over" are spread all over cities and towns. Prosperity and hope seemed abundant for Americans this in time for not only a new decade, but a new start. The early 1920s would indeed prove to be fruitful, as there was consistent mass consumerism, advertising, music, and culture all happening at once, along with cities quickly continuing to be built. However, this abundance of hope and new beginnings would soon be flipped with the stock market crash in the fall of 1929, ultimately precipitating the Great Depression. Businesses failed and unemployment was widespread. Even veterans and their families struggled, and in the summer of 1932, nearly 20,000 World War I veterans marched in Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of cash bonuses for their military service in the war. As Americans were persevering through the Great Depression, war was pressing forward in Europe and Asia. Throughout the 1930s, America was still debating what their role in the war would be, if any. Most Americans believed that the isolationist movement was what was best for the country. Staying out of foreign conflicts and focusing on rebuilding American lives was prioritized. Staying out of the war was bolstered by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, as during his presidential re-election campaign in 1940, he heavily promoted a promise to Americans of keeping America out of the war. Roosevelt would go forth to win his third presidential election in 1940, and he quickly began strategizing the need to formalize U.S. aid to China, as conflict was continuously escalating between China and Japan. Through the Lend-Lease program, the United States would continue building on their strategy of increasing aid to China. However, this decision would lead to be an official embargo on the trade of all military useful items with Japan. As America yearned for a more fruitful beginning to the new decade of the 1940s, Japan had another vision in mind. On December 7, 1941, Japan would go forth with conducting a surprise military strike on the U.S. naval base Pearl Harbor.
Both my mother and father were at Pearl Harbor the day of the bombing. They were at Mass on Sunday morning. My father said someone came in through the church door and said Pearl Harbor was being bombed. His response was, "They're going to cry wolf." But then they realized it was a real attack.
My father, Charles J. Hessig, was on the USS Sacramento on December 7th, 1941. He's a Pearl Harbor survivor. Growing up, my dad never ever talked about Pearl Harbor. Days before, they had been dropping flour sacks on the ships at Pearl Harbor. That's how they practiced bombings. My dad was dressed to go to church. In his dress whites, he was going into shore, and he was going down to the beach to go to church. He heard the planes first. He said, "Why are they going to drop flour sacks on us when we're standing out here in our dress whites to go to church?" About that time, something went boom.
Isaac Campbell Kidd Sr. was my grandfather. He was a Rear Admiral, and he was Commander Battleship Division 1. Granddad was, he was an athlete. He loved to swim, and he loved to walk. And on this particular day, December 7th, 1941, he had been up early. He had taken the Admiral's barge over to Ford Island, which is where the officers' club and the swimming pool was, and he'd been swimming his laps. And he was returning from that about 7:30 in the morning when his barge came alongside Arizona, and the attack began.
He was on the USS Dale, and the Dale had the ready duty, so it was one of the first ships out of the harbor. So he had to get a ride out on another ship to meet the Dale. Meanwhile, my mother turned around to go back to the apartment, and a shell dropped in the street, just missing her. My mother left Pearl Harbor on a transport ship and went back to San Francisco, where she spent the rest of the war working. Dad spent the whole war in the Pacific on the Dale.
His ship was in dry dock. They had taken the engines out, so they couldn't have gone anywhere or anything. Their guns weren't loaded, everything was locked up, because these gentlemen happened to be in dry dock. There was nothing, they couldn't get to anything. And someone finally said, "That's it," and they busted the lock off, and they were carrying ammo boxes. My dad carried one and these things weighed 80, 90, even 100 pounds. and he was carrying them up on his shoulder up the stairs to load the guns. They did shoot down 2 planes, and I remember he always said when it was all over, they still were leery and worried. He remembers sitting out on the front of the ship eating hot dogs and sauerkraut for dinner. And he could see the flag of the Arizona across the water sticking out of the water. After that, they put him up in the crow's nest, you know, because they were still worried that there was going to be planes coming in. And that's where he sat all night, waiting for the next attack.
Admiral Kidd immediately left his barge and went to the bridge of Arizona to do whatever he could do. He stepped away out onto the bridge wing when the first explosion hit Arizona, and he disappeared, blown over the side. It was some minutes later that he returned to the bridge of the ship, having swung around the ship, and he went back to the bridge, seriously wounded. There was someone tending his wounds. The individual tending his wounds stepped away from the Admiral when the magazines exploded. And that was the last anyone ever saw of Admiral Kidd. When the ship sunk, Arizona settled on the bottom. And you've seen these devastating pictures of Arizona burning and the bridge tipping over and black smoke coming out of it. It was a terrible wreck. Isaac Campbell Kidd was consumed in the blast.
Pearl Harbor, why is it so important? Why would people spend all this time thinking about and dedicate part of their lives to remembering something that was absolutely the worst day of their lives? Big reason for it is they were standing watch. They were standing watch in a way that no one would forget, and we would never let that happen again. And it comes back to what sets Pearl Harbor apart and what sets it as a different scenario is it was an unprovoked attack. It was, really the point at which America lost its innocence. It really became, for that generation, for those men and women that were at Pearl Harbor, it became, hey, we've got to talk about this, no matter how painful it is.
You look back at 9/11, and I've heard that often referred to, that was a Pearl Harbor moment. From the military standpoint, we also use Pearl Harbor as an example, not to be caught unprepared for the United States. As citizens, we need to recognize what those kind of events do to our country. Good, bad, or indifferent, just be aware.
Failure to recognize history gives cause to repeat history. And so it's vital that we remember historical events such as Pearl Harbor, because it keeps the memory alive, but also pushes us in a direction of being conscious and aware of our surroundings and being conscious and aware of how in a split second everything can go from peaceful to chaotic.
When you can be of service and be beyond yourself, I think it's the opportunity to see it open up and get out of your own way. It's through participation we showcase the fact that we've got this thing called goodwill or honor or spirit inside of us, and that America is a place that's not perfect, but worth fighting for.